today, the Verizon guy.
All right, you ready?
All right. Good morning. My name is Tony Walters. As Neville said, I am a former Victor Valley College student, but I still take classes because you can never take enough classes. You need that knowledge. I work for the Mojave Desert RCD. I'm their irrigation water management specialist. And basically what I do is I go out and I help farmers save water. But there's more to it than just knowing water. You have to understand the relationships between plants and soil. And a lot of our farmers are new farmers. So you have to be able to communicate with them and give them a basic education on what they got themselves into, which can be interesting sometimes. So I'm going to give you a little background on the RCD and what we do and who we work for, or who we work with, I should say. They actually work for us, I like to say. So what is the RCD? The RCD was formerly known as Soil Conservation Districts. It all came out of the Dust Bowl era. If you guys are familiar with your early history, you'll recall the Dust Bowl. And due to improper soil management, we destroyed a lot of our good farmland because we lost our topsoil. So Congress, along with FDR, they signed into, on April 27, 1935, it was the Soil Conservation Act, and that is basically why RCDs exist nowadays and the NRCS, which I'll talk about. This act actually directly corresponded to the National Resource Conservation Service, who is one of our sister agencies that we work very closely with within the Department of Agriculture. So I don't know if you guys can read that, but if you were around in the 30s, you'd be reading things in the newspaper on how many acres they were losing and what was going on. And they estimate that they had lost over 100 million acres were being lost, somewhere upwards of 125 million acres that were currently in use were losing topsoil, and other acreages were being destroyed from the sand blow, from the Dust Bowl, from those big storms. So, after they passed that act, they formed the National Resource Conservation Service. FDR, sorry, Lynn. I'm trying not to move around. Okay, so they had this little issue of, they were a national agency, but they really needed to connect with the local people. And, back in the day, they did not like government people showing up and telling them what to do. So FDR, which I think did a really neat thing, he actually just wrote letters to the governors and asked them if they would consider, formulating some sort of locally organized soil conservation districts. So all the governors, they responded, and in 1940, California enacted Division 9 of the California Public Resources Code, which designates, at the time there were soil conservation districts, but now they're RCDs as special districts of the state. This portion of the California law gives RCDs their roles and responsibilities. They have governing boards, and they act as liaisons. They coordinate with the National Resource Service, and they basically are just there to help people. So what do RCDs do? The easiest answer is we do a little bit of everything, and that's why I really enjoy my job, is because I don't just go out there and play with water. I get involved in plant restoration projects, soil conservation projects, indexing of resources, and the list goes on. Up in our local RCD up here, these are some of the programs that we're involved in. Water conservation, which is my primary duty as the irrigation water management specialist, working with the farmers, helping them conserve water. Erosion control, and we do a little bit of both, but our primary erosion control is sand blow, because we have huge issues with sand blow, especially out in the Newberry Springs area, Lucerne Valley, and El Mirage areas, and you can definitely see that on a windy day. Just recently, they had to close down Highway 247 because of the sand was blowing so hard. One of our huge projects we do is an invasive weed control. Good morning. We coordinate with other local agencies, and we, up and down the Mojave River, I really need my notes, but that's okay. I missed that little computer. But anyway, up and down the Mojave River, it's around 50 miles up and down the Mojave River from the headwaters all the way down to south of Newberry Springs. They've been doing weed abatement, and that involves chemical and mechanical weed abatement. And they're primarily focusing on salt cedar tamarisk, arundo, Russian olive, pepperweed, and did I miss anything, Neville?
No.
Is that primarily it? And so that ties directly into the stream channel stabilization and water quality. Because I'm not sure how far along you guys have gotten in invasive species, but the trees like the salt cedar tamarisk, they use a lot of water. They're detrimental to the other native species that live around them. So they really don't do anything. So we're trying to stabilize those riparian areas by eliminating them. We also focus on proper range management on both private and federal lands. We have some ranchers that, they're grazing, they're doing different things. We try to help them out. We've worked directly with some of the dairies up here to help them mitigate some of their nitrates. So we're involved in a lot of different things. We're also a big project. We have a person up in Big Bear. Is she going to speak? Is she going to come in and lecture? Cheryl?
On our field trip.
Oh, awesome. So you guys will meet her on the field trip, but she's part of the Relief, and she does most of the wildfire restoration work up in the San Bernardino Mountains. Recently, they just did a big project out at Santa's Village, which I heard on the radio this morning that they're trying to reopen by Christmas, so that'll be kind of cool. And one of the main things that we do, and none of that is possible without community outreach and education. And it's really important that we reach out and that we just inform people what's out there and what's going on, because a lot of people just don't have time. And one of the struggles I ran into working with farmers is we have an influx of new farmers up in the high desert. And most of them were never farmers. They never went to school for it. They just decided they want to live the dream and plant some trees. And so I stay pretty busy trying to show them how they can save water and how they can manage their soils properly. So here's our RCD. The state of California has over 100 RCDs. We're the largest in the nation. I'll read that little thing to you. Our RCD was established in March of 1951. It's the largest of the 3,000 RCDs in the nation. Our total acreage is 11,500,000, which is 17,969 square miles. The district is so large that you could include the states of Delaware, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Rhode Island, and you could probably throw Puerto Rico in there as well. We have a huge service area. I actually have customers out in Needles. I've worked with the groups out there growing alfalfa, and I have customers out in Joshua Tree. So I'm spread pretty thin, and I'm the only IWM specialist from the Cajon Pass to State Line. So I can stay pretty busy. So let's get into a little water conservation. I'm going to bounce around a little bit. I'll talk about soils, water conservation. And if you guys have questions, please, write them down, because I think we're going to have a Q&A at the end.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. So irrigation water management, what is it? Basically, we try to help farmers save water. And we have to be pretty innovative because there's new technologies out there. There's an expense that's required with upgrading old systems, which is where our very cool relationship with NRCS comes into play. Because if there's a farmer out there, and one of the nice things I like under the farm bill is I can actually see our tax money being spent wisely, and I can help be a part of that. Because there's some matching funds available, or cost share they like to call it, where they can actually upgrade systems involving different practices, irrigation, mulching. There's over 500. So there's money available to help these new farmers and some of the big farmers upgrade to save water, conserve their soils, and just have good overall farm management practices. One of the big things that I've run into is irrigation scheduling. That's probably the singlest, easiest way that you can save water right away. Most people overwater, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but you know, plants, they need to breathe. So when you flood them with water, they can't breathe in their root zone and they drown. And a lot of the farms I go out to, the trees are droopy and they're like, oh, I need more water. And I'm like, no, your trees are drowning. You need to stop watering. And I have a real interesting story about that, which I'll share later on. But, and one of the main things is good soil management, because there's kind of this trifecta I like to explain to people when you're dealing with irrigation, is you have to take into consideration your soils, you have to take into consideration your plants, and your climate in the area. Once you have those three things figured out, then you can really schedule your irrigation properly. And soils is a huge issue because nothing can happen without good soil. It holds your water, it helps hold in nutrients, it provides that transportation medium for water to help the nutrients get into the plants. So we need those things. And unfortunately, we have a lot of bad farming practices. And you know, a lot of those involve, you know, and we see that with construction, they typically will just grade everything. And I'll have some pictures coming up. But that's one of the easiest ways to really get off to a bad start, is when you destroy that good structure in your soil. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the water crisis, because that drives all of this right now. So the current water crisis has led to an increased focus on water conservation management, which is good for me and for people wanting to get into water resource careers. California is a hydraulic society. We're kind of fortunate up here because we get most of our water from groundwater sources, but most of California, especially Southern California, is not that way. We rely on water from in Northern California and Central California, and that impacts us because we have to follow the regulations that also impact them. So water for Southern California travels through thousands of miles of an aqueduct system and reservoirs. You know, despite rainfall in Northern California, the reservoirs are still historically low. So even though they've gotten a little bit of rain up there, they're still not where they should be. And I've got some graphs here that'll come up, and it'll kind of show how the water starts to taper off as you get into Southern California, because you know, we're a desert down here. But people like to grow lots of stuff, so that makes my life fun. But so let's look at some of this stuff. So here's Northern California, and on Nev, on that slide, does it say where I got this from? Because it's a really good, it's a water blog, California Water Blog. Is that it?
Say on there.
Okay. Well, these all came from a site called California Water Blog, and they're updated once a month. And it's a really great resource if you're looking at rainfall patterns or just what's going on. So right here, you can look at, in the red is the historical numbers, and the blue is where we're at. So even though we've been getting some rain up in Northern California, you know, like Lake Shasta is normally at 103% capacity at this time of year historically, but it's only at 62%. And you can look at some of those numbers, and then it kind of puts things in perspective. That water travels down here. There's not a lot of it, so we need to conserve. So let's move on to this is the precipitation map. So this one's really interesting also, because this is Northern Sierra, which is the reservoir system we were just looking at. So the average is right over here, 57.9, and right now we're at 37.2. And the average they figure out is about 50. So the daily precipitation average would be up there, but the overall is around 50, but we're still below that. And as we start to move south, so here's the San Joaquin precipitation, it starts to drop even lower. So typically, their wettest years, they were at 77. Their averages were 40. But right now, their daily precipitation is at 40, but their average for 14 and 15 is at 19. So they're way down. So this red line is what, the last year has brought. So now as we move even further south down into the Tulare Basin, it gets even worse. So the daily averages were right here at 25.8, the historical, but the daily currently is at 13.5. I really tried to find one of these for our area, but I couldn't because it's a really good visual graphic. But at my house, I keep track of my rainfall. And last year at this time, we'd had about 6 inches or so because we had a ton of rain coming down. We had those storms. And right now we're at trace amounts. So, weather patterns change, rain patterns change. But the thing that we can do is we can conserve. So what does the data shows that as we move south, we get less rainfall. And we need to be more cognitive of what we're doing with our water as we move down south, especially since most of Southern California depends on that water from the Central and Northern California. So the Mojave is still in an extreme drought. On that California water blog, it shows the drought conditions, and we're still in an extreme drought condition. Recently, one of my other hats I wear is I went out and I did a national resource index of the local area, and we actually look at the precipitation levels and how the plants are doing. And the plants that we were looking at compared to last year, the growth rates were way down. They're only at about 20% of their growth rate that they normally would be at, and that's directly related to the drought. So, as drought increases, different things increase. Fire dangers increase, water conservation increases. So what can farmers do to save water and still provide a vital service? That's where I come into, and that's the irrigation water management. So irrigation water management provides technical assistance to farmers to help save water. Farmers don't waste water out of malice or because, I just want to waste water. They do it, a lot of it they just don't know any better. They've been doing it for so long, it works, and they just want to continue doing what maybe their grandfather did or their father did. But, there's new technologies that come along, there's new research that comes along, and that's where the liaison role that we play at RCD is really critical because we have to relay that information in a way that the farmers are going to buy into it. You have to make it sustainable. There's your keyword there, Neff. So they can, see the big picture. Because if you help them save water and they lose crop production, they're not going to do it. They're going to go back to their old way because if they lose crop production, then they lose money. So it's kind of a big process, and you have to be aware of what you're doing because you don't want to go out there and kill the guy's crop. So the process involves, basically proper scheduling and the updating the system to industry's best practices and the use of current technologies. And a lot of what we see out here is we try to get them to switch over from basically flood watering, like flood bubblers on their trees, and we try to get them to switch over to drip systems. My favorite drip system is subsurface. I'm still trying to get everyone to buy into it, but if you manage it properly and you know what you're doing when you install it, we've seen some really good successes. We recently had a pistachio farm out in Newberry Springs that went from micro spray sprinklers, which are it's still drip, but it's a small sprinkler, and they switched over to a subsurface drip system, and they've already saved 10 acre-feet of water. Wow. So that's a huge savings. It saves water and it saves electricity, money out of your pocket to pump the water, and it also reduces carbon emissions because electricity production, creates a carbon issue. So, important part of IWM is understanding the water-soil-plant relationship. And I'll probably say that a lot because it's really, you have to understand those things. You can take a bunch of irrigation classes and you could go out there and give advice on the irrigation system, but you need to understand how that system is going to operate in the soil, and you need to understand how it's going to affect the plants. So, there's Nev's favorite slide. So water conservation in agriculture only works if it's sustainable. And that's really something that I figured out. A lot of the farmers I visit, they're happy. They're like, hey, I don't need to save water. My plants are doing fine. So I basically have to break it down to, try to give them a guilt trip about, hey, we're in a water crisis. We're at your area's in a 55% ramp down. There's an environmental impact. But once I hit the economy part where I can show them how much money they're going to save in their electric bill, then they normally start listening. And then when I throw in, maybe you could get some cost share from a federal agency, then their ears perk up a little bit more. So it's all about figuring out how to communicate with the farmer that what they're going to do is sustainable. And it's a challenge sometimes because, a lot of them, they're 70 years old, they've been doing it for 30 years, and they don't want to change. And so you have to get creative on how you approach, and basically you're a salesman. You have to sell them water conservation. So one of the big parts in IWM, water management, is your soil. So right here is very tragic. This guy called up the office and he said, hey, I just bought 20 acres. I'm going to put some trees in. Can you come out and give me some advice? So I pulled in, and the first thing out of my mouth was, well, why'd you grade? Traditional farming techniques, i.e. the grading that we're used to, it destroys soil structure and it removes topsoil and organic matter. The desert has very little organic matter to begin with, so when you scrape it away, you've already kind of put yourself in the negative. And then when you run it over with a big heavy tractor and a blade, and you destroy what little structure was there, well, now you've destroyed some of your water holding capacity and your infiltration rates. But it looks pretty. They're like, hey, it looks nice. But we really try to stress to the farming community, especially if you're doing orchards, and we'll get into some of the different farming techniques later, but you don't have to grade your whole property. In fact, just leaving those indigenous plants there, like some of the atroplex, the rabbit bush, those things bloom and flower. They're going to bring in your pollinators, and they don't use any water. They sustain themselves on what little rain we get, and they're going to continue to put organic matter and try to maintain that structure. So when we talk about soil structure, just so we're all on the same page, if I say soil structure to you guys, what does that mean to you? I'm going to pick on you because I know you.
It's just basically all the matter and everything that's in the soil, all the organisms and basically everything that's in the soil.
Right, so we've got organisms in the soil, and soil is primarily made up of sand, silt, and clay. And depending on how they're distributed, will tell you what type of soil you have. One of the big things in soil structure is we have pore space and we have soil aggregates. When you compact them with a big heavy tractor, you destroy those pore spaces. And those pore spaces is where the air and the water makes interchanges with itself. And that's what allows the roots to breathe, take up nutrients, and take up water. So when you destroy that structure, it's really hard to get it back. In fact, it's almost impossible to get it back to its natural state. You can incorporate, compost and fertilizers, but you're going to have to till it, and that structure is only going to be there temporarily, and you're going to have to do that pretty much every season. And but that's what we're used to. That's what we see on TV, the farmer with the big tractor, and for large commercial operations, it's easier for them to do it that way. But when we're talking, small farms, You don't have to grade everything, especially if you're putting in trees. I always, let them know, hey, don't grade. And when you build a house, there's no reason to grade the entire lot because you're just going to increase erosion, water erosion, sand blow, destroy your soil structures, and I can go on about that, so I'll hit the next slide. So the best way to increase water savings is good soil practices from the start. Since I actually had your book you're using, I actually pulled some of this stuff out. So hopefully you read ahead and you guys have seen some of this stuff. But we're going to talk a little bit about terracing, contour farming, strip cropping, cover crops, agroforestry, and some windbreaks. I deal a lot with windbreaks. As an IWM specialist, I'll be honest, they're not my favorite thing because they use water. But at least in our area, but when they're used properly and you plant trees that you can just have to supplemental water for a little while and natural indigenous trees and they can take off on their own, it can actually be very beneficial, especially if you're in a high sand blow area or even a wind area. Going back to Newberry, because I work with the pistachio farmers a lot, they actually have seen some of their crops suffer this year because during the high pollination season, they're getting 60-mile-an-hour wind gusts. So what that does is the wind's blowing so fast that the trees can't pollinate. But if you have large enough windbreak trees, that can mitigate some of that. Not for the entire crop, but for some of the crop. So windbreaks are very viable, but you have to make sure that you apply them in the right situations. So let's talk about terracing. We don't see a whole lot of this in the United States, but around the world, you definitely will see these things. South America, Greece, Italy, where they have very steep slopes. You might find this in some of the areas in the Central Valley where they're growing grapes. But basically, terracing involves a grading in a terrace, and you make a flat structure, but you kind of follow the contour of the hill. And what that does is it slows the water down. Because when you're farming on a slope, you're going to increase your runoff. Because your soil is not as developed on a slope. So when you terrace the slope of the land, it actually will slow down the water and will actually slow down the erosion. So that's a very quick review of terracing. So contour farming is sort of like terracing, except you follow the complete contour of the slope or the hill. And you're not grading into it, making little different flat landscapes. The contour farming, it'll make these little dams, and the water will flow down, kind of store up here, flow down. So that also increases a little bit extra water storage and also slows down erosion, which is, whenever you're farming on any type of slopes, water erosion is always a huge concern. How am I doing on time?
You're good.
Oh, cool. All right.
I'll tell you 10 minutes.
All right. So, strip cropping. Strip cropping is something that I'd love to see more of, just because you can it's better for the soil. It does a few different things. You can actually plant a few different crops in your field. So you can put a crop like corn, oats, and then they have hay up here. And this is on a slope. So these different areas will start to catch runoff, and also like the hay can also help to mitigate if you have like extra nutrient runoff. It'll slow those things down. You see a lot of this out in the Midwest. Sometimes they call it like buddy planting, or you'll plant different crops in. So maybe you'll have corn here, and maybe they'll plant alfalfa, because corn sucks up nitrogen and alfalfa returns nitrogen into the soil. So you can actually plan your crops and your rotations to help put nutrients back into the soil without having to use a lot of fertilizers. So when you can get legumes in there, it'll return that nutrients, the nitrogen back into the soil. And, it's a smart way to farm. It helps with the erosion, it helps with nutrient management, and it diversifies your crops a little bit. It also is part of like your pest management, because if you're farming with just one crop and you have some kind of insect come in, it can wipe out your crop. But if you have the crop mixed up with different types of crops, you only lose 30% of your crop. So it's a smarter way to play the game. Cover crops. I like cover crops. It's hard. Cover crops up here are tricky because we have a water issue. But if you use the right type of grasses and that grow with very little water, cover crops can save you a lot of headache. They hold on to your topsoil. So in this picture you see, they were growing corn and they've put in ryegrass during the off season. And so what that does is it's going to put organic matter back into your soil. It's also going to hold on to your topsoil. And it's going to help some of that nutrients get back into that soil that the corn used. Cover crops can be very useful. It's hard up here with cover crops because, of course, we're in a water issue. But we've been researching. We actually did a research project here at VVC and out in Newberry Springs we were trying different grasses with very little watering or no watering at all to see which will take. Because we're trying to find a cover crop up here that people can use when they fallow fields or if they're in between seasons. And that'll help hold down that topsoil and also return some organic matter into that topsoil.
Have you guys found one that works yet?
Unfortunately, no. But that's part of research, right? All of our test crops died. We were kind of doing the dance, hoping that the big El Nino would come. And so we planted, before El Nino was supposed to come, and well, El Nino didn't get the memo because he didn't show up. So, we were out there seeding, by hand, large acreages of fields, but that's all part of the game. So we know that doesn't work in that area. But we tried some of the Indian ryegrass, and I forgot the other one that we tried out there. But, maybe next year we'll try something else. So agroforestry and windbreaks. I kind of included them together because, agroforestry is basically, making a barrier with trees around your crop. And windbreaks kind of do the same thing. It's very helpful if you have a high wind area and you have crops that are very susceptible to wind. It also it'll save your topsoil. Maybe you have a crop that doesn't like direct sunlight all the time. You can kind of surround it with the trees and it'll help create that sun barrier and that wind barrier. Other parts of the country, you'll see really dense, windbreaks and agroforestry. Other parts of the world, because they farm in the middle of a forest, they kind of do the agroforestry by default because they put their crops in there. But, it's just another way to help conserve the land. They didn't destroy all the trees. They plant trees back in for the windbreaks. One of my favorite things, mulching, because mulching is directly related to water conservation. A lot of people confuse mulch with compost, but they're two totally separate animals. Mulching can be wood, or it can be plastic, or whatever you want to put on top of that soil to protect it.
So what about straw?
Straw is a mulch, yeah, absolutely. It just depends on what you want to do with it, how you want to use it. Anybody recognize this area here? That's Lucerne Valley. So these are jujube trees, which are one of the huge orchard crops that have come into our area. But this gentleman here, we had talked to about mulching, and he's doing mulching, and he's setting it out there right now. Mulching does a couple things. Especially in our area, we have a very high evapotranspiration rate, and that's tied into soil evaporation also. So we have a very high soil evaporation rate. So mulch, when you lay it down, it creates a barrier, and it can help regulate the soil temperature a little bit. It'll keep it cooler, and when you keep things cooler, the water will evaporate slower. Also, it helps with water retention. So if you are irrigating, you create that barrier, it can help retain some water. And over time, mulch will break down. Over a long time and a lot of water, it'll break down and reincorporate into the soil. But I've actually talked to a lot of farmers, and they're like, oh, I mulch because it adds nutrients to the soil. Well, not really. Mulch is there to protect the soil. It creates a barrier. Now, composting, on the other hand, which I'll get to, that when you incorporate it, then you can actually put some nutrients in. Because the only way that nutrients are going to get to a tree or a crop is through water. So if you don't have a lot of water, you're not going to be able to get that nutrients in. So composting. I like this picture right here because this is something that you can make very cheaply and start making your own compost. And you can pretty much put whatever you want in the compost. That's an egg carton, but it's one of those cornstarch egg cartons that'll break down with water. So, but anyway, composting does a couple things. It adds organic matter back into your soil. It adds nutrients. And it also saves our landfills. Because the less you send to the dump, the less the landfill is going to be taken up with green waste that you can actually turn into a really great soil if you do it properly. You can go on, there's classes and classes and classes on composting. But you can start this at your house. You can get your lawn clippings, you can get your old rotten tomatoes out of the fridge, your coffee grounds. You can start making a little pit, put some water on them, mix them up, and let it do its thing. It's important that you keep air. You allow air to get into it. That's why I love this little fence type composter. Because you can put this together for about $5. You'll probably spend $100 on that barrel. So go cheap and make your own soil. But composting is a great amendment. We push composting a lot in lieu of chemical fertilizers. But as with composting, you need to, as with anything, you need to know what you're putting into your compost pile. And you need to be aware of what you're getting. And if you're buying compost by the truckload, you should always ask for a chemical breakdown on it. Because by law, they have to analyze what their compost is, so you know what you're putting into your soil. There's a lot of, especially with the mulches, there's a lot of free mulch out there. Just take a look at it before you get it. Make sure it's something that you want to put in your yard. Not all mulch and compost is the same, and nor is it created equally. If they're doing a lot of curbside pickup for their composting, those what are they, the brown trash cans in Victorville or whatever for the clippings, sometimes people put trash in there. Sometimes that'll get in your compost and in your mulch. So you want to be aware of that. There's been some recent ordinances that address those percentages on what they're allowed to actually have in the mulch and the compost, which is good. And it's getting better. They've been told that they can't send a lot of that green waste and to the garbage dump anymore, that they have to compost it. So that's better for us because that means they have to get rid of it. So sometimes they'll bring it out for free because they need to get rid of it. Just be aware of what you're getting, take a look at it, and make sure you're not going to do more harm than good. So let's get back to water. So irrigation saving starts with understanding a few basic things. The plants, plant uptake and the uptake rate. I kind of messed that up a little bit. But, the plant uptake rate. How much water is your plant going to use? So before you can do anything with your irrigation, you need to understand how much water is my plant going to use. You also need to understand your soil. Am I growing on a sandy soil or am I growing on a heavy clay soil? Am I on a loamy soil? That'll help adjust your irrigation. What's that? 3 minutes? Oh, okay. Man. I better.
Nev was supposed to give you 10, right? Nev, what's the time?
Oh, it's just coming up on 10.
Oh, okay. Vanna White over here was waving me down. But anyway, so we've got, the soil. What's the growth medium? And something I want to point out. Oh, wrong button. Soil Web. If you Google Soil Web, it's a really cool app you can put on your phone. And you can actually hit my location and it'll give you a breakdown of the soil. Now it's a ballpark figure. You always want to go out there and take a look yourself. But those folks that do Soil Web are run right out of our office in Victorville. So they work for NRCS and they go out and they take thousands of soil samples and they create these really cool soil maps. And I always tell people, even before you build a house, look at your Soil Web map and see what are you building on, or if you're going to plant, what kind of soil is there? Soil Web. Okay. So next thing, and another big thing is your climate. You want to look at your ETO rates for your area. RCD with some other partners and Victor Valley College has their own CMIS station. And CMIS stands for the California, I forgot an I in there. There should be another I. The California Irrigation Management Information System. So you can Google CMIS and you can create a little account and you can get all the historical records for your area. And it tells you what your rainfall is, what your evaporation rates are, wind speed, and all that good stuff. So once you understand this relationship, you can actually start figuring out how you're going to irrigate. So let me start speeding it up here. So, first thing I do, I go out there is, how is the producer irrigating? Even with the most current technology, overwatering can occur. I was recently out at a farm out in Phelan, and they were over irrigating I have a soil probe. I dropped it all the way down to the hilt of the handle, it's about 5 feet tall, and the water was saturated 4.5, 5 feet under the root zone. So even though they had a great system, top of the line, they were over irrigating. So it's important that you understand irrigation scheduling and what you need to put down. As I said before, plants breathe. If the soil pore spaces are filled up with only water, you're going to drown your plant. Just like us, plants need oxygen. If you deprive them of oxygen in the root zone, they will die. Unless you have a specially designed plant, but that's a whole nother class. So here's some examples. Bad watering. This is a flood bubbler that you buy at Home Depot. It should be not attached to an agricultural orchard. That's a no-no. But it's cheap, so people do it. As you see, they're filling up the water wells. And what's interesting here, and this is another issue, is you see that white ring around there? That's from water evaporation because the water's sitting in there. And those are an accumulation of salts. And in certain areas up here, there's high salts in the water. And there's also high salts in the soil. So when you allow the water to stand, it's gonna pull those salts out and they're gonna sit on your topsoil. And over time, that'll start affecting your infiltration rate, and it'll also start affecting the plant if they're not a salt-tolerant plant. So, standing water in our area equals a water loss. That's a big no-no. So it's important to know what the soil infiltration rate is. It's different between, say, sand and a heavy clay soil. Sand, it's going to be quicker. You can pour more water down. If it's a high clay or a loamy soil, you're going to have to slow the water down. So when you're using drip, you're going to want to adjust your emitters because you can get emitters to put out as much water as you want or as little as you want. And it's important to understand what soil you're working with when you design a system or you're updating a system.
Oh, we lost Brandon already, so we probably need.
Water quality. Okay, so
So you
That-
can go to questions.
micro drip, subsurface, LIPA. There's some pictures here. Here's the micro drip. This essentially is a subsurface system. You just bury it, or you can run it topside. Flood irrigation. This is actually out at Fort Mojave. We helped them change over to a LIPA system, which is a low energy proficient. Hold on, I gotta look at the acronym. Low energy precision application. There we go. The LIPA system